No?
Well, yes, I know the study that they're referring to that was done. The lead author was Susan Griffin, who's an economist, works for the CDC. The trouble with that study is it completely ignored the cost of treating dental fluorosis, which can cost up to $1,000 a tooth. And we have at least 4% of 12 to 15-year-olds with moderate or severe dental fluorosis. So you could imagine the huge cost of treating that condition. It ignores, of course, any other health ailments which may be related to fluoride exposure. And also, they exaggerated the benefits in their calculations. They assumed a greater benefit than they actually are achieving. And, of course, it also ignores the reality that they're using a hazardous grade material instead of a pharmaceutical grade. If they were forced to use pharmaceutical grade, then you would go to a more rational delivery system, which would be optional use of fluoridated bottled water, where you make fluoridated bottled water available in pharmacies, say, and then you can choose whether you use it or not. Right. If you use that approach, you could use pharmaceutical grade sodium fluoride instead of this industrial grade hazardous waste material.
Well, then I'm going to read you another paragraph here, okay? It says here, fluoridation reports indicate that 12-year-old children living in states where more than half of the communities have fluoridated water have 26% fewer decayed tooth surfaces per year than 12-year-old children living in states where less than 1/4 of the communities are fluoridated.
Well, first of all, look at the way they use percentages there. You know, this is based upon that study. The authors were Brunel and Carlos from 1990. This is the study that looked at 39,000 children in 84 communities, and the average difference in tooth decay was 0.6 of one tooth surface. Now, that's what you find out if you actually go to the table 6, and look at the numbers. But they didn't report 0.6 of a tooth surface. They described that as 18% saving in tooth decay, 18%. And they also did some hand waving and said if you subtract the benefit from fluoridated toothpaste, it may be as high as 24, 25%. So I think that's where the 26% figure. But notice they do this all the time. They convert a very, very small saving when you're comparing two small numbers into what sounds like an impressive percentage. You know, the average person, when they hear 18% less tooth decay, they imagine sort of 5 or 6 tooth decaying and then reduce that by 18%. But no, the difference is 0.6 of one tooth surface. Okay. The absolute saving is less than 1%.
All right. It says here, too, a related analysis found that children, I'm reading from the CDC's website, a related analysis found that children living in non-fluoridated communities in states that are highly fluoridated receive partial benefits of fluoridation just from eating foods and drinking beverages processed in fluoridated communities. So if you don't have fluoride in your water, you are still, quote unquote, benefiting from the fact that the beverages you drink may have been processed with fluoridated water, or that you may get produce coming out of farms that have sprayed fluoridated water on the crops.
Yeah, and use fluoridated pesticides and so on. And yes, this is the so-called halo effect. That the reason they're arguing that the reason that there's so little difference in tooth decay between fluoridated and non-fluoridated communities is that the non-fluoridated communities are getting fluoride from other sources, products, beverages, and so on. And that is true. But notice also that they're also getting the harm. Because when I said that 41% of children aged 12 to 15 have dental fluorosis, that was for all American children. So even children today in non-fluoridated communities are getting too much fluoride by this dissipation of fluoride through the beverages and the food chains and so on. But the halo effect does not apply when you're looking, say, at Europe, because you've got such few countries fluoridated in Europe. So unless children in Sweden are drinking Guinness from Ireland, which is one of the countries which is fluoridated, there is no halo effect there. In other words, fluoride in beverages and food produced in a fluoridated community are not getting into the non-fluoridated communities. So you can't use that as an argument as to why there's so little difference in tooth decay between fluoridated countries and non-fluoridated countries in Europe. But again, I think that those things that you've read indicates very clearly that the CDC is acting like a propaganda operation. It is promoting fluoridation. That's their function. They promote fluoridation. And they don't have the toxicologists on staff to do an independent, certainly not an independent assessment of the damages. Instead, you get this propaganda material. And that's not what I would have expected 15 years ago before I got involved, that health agencies should be doing. You would think that the bureaucrats, civil servants working for health agencies would be giving objective information to the public and the decision maker, and that the spinning should not begin with them. If there's any spin involved, it should come from politicians later on, but it shouldn't come from the civil servants. And this is, I think, is eroding the public's trust in this country, in their health agencies, not only this kind of shenanigans when bureaucracies are protecting a practice rather than protecting the health, but also the big money from economic interest, the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, influencing the National Institute of Health and the other health agencies. We're losing the public's trust, and one way to regain it is to admit that they were wrong on fluoridation and stop this stupid practice.
I don't think I've ever lived in a community that didn't fluoridate the water. I could be wrong, but I always just assumed it was.
Well, you can tell me if you tell me the names of the communities that you were living in, about 70-odd% of Americans now are drinking fluoridated water, over 180 million. Tell me the towns that you've lived in, Ian.
Okay.
I'll give you
All right, I live right now in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Fluoridated.
Fluoridated. Atlanta, Georgia.
Georgia has mandatory fluoridation.
Okay. Nashville, Tennessee.
Fluoridated.
Chicago, Illinois.
Fluoridated. Illinois has mandatory fluoridation.
Oh, there you go. Okay, well, I've made my point. All right, and then I lived for a while in New Jersey, on the Jersey Shore.
New Jersey doesn't have many communities fluoridated. So when you were living in New Jersey, you probably escaped fluoridation.
Wow, how about that? But just to make the point again, this is a medicine, which is they're touting at the CDC that they're force feeding a medicine. And on that basis alone, it really makes you wonder, I mean, that's odd that they're doing that. And there's no proof other than what we've been getting into a little bit here, that the ingestion of this medicine is the way to go. It has a topical benefit, but this internalized, there really isn't. But we were just sharing some of that right there. So have you had any successes then as the head of the Fluoride Action Network? Have you had any to talk communities out of that either were offering it that are no longer putting it in their water supply, or cities that were thinking about it that decided not to do it?
Yes, it's much easier to stop communities putting it in than to reverse the status quo of stopping communities that are doing it. But we have had some very significant victories recently. Juneau, Alaska, followed by Fairbanks, Alaska, have stopped. Some communities in Texas have stopped. In Canada, major cities like Calgary has stopped. That's 1.1 million. Most of British Columbia is non-fluoridated. Most of Quebec now is non-fluoridated. Quebec City stopped. Only 3% of actually Quebec is fluoridated. So, and many communities in Ontario have stopped fluoridating very recently. Earlier this year, Waterloo, and actually last October, Waterloo voted it out by referendum. So yes, if we can get it to referendum, we have a very good chance of stopping fluoridation.
Okay. And as you're doing that, as you're going across the country, as you're making your case against fluoridation, are there then also people that are on the other side of it, paid for by the fluoride industry, that come along on your heels or at the same time and debate you on fluoride?
By and large, they will not debate. We had the closest to a debate we had recently was in front of a committee for Austin, Texas. The council there a doctor and a dentist spoke in favor of fluoridation. Another dentist and I spoke against it, and that was not actually a debate so much as each side presented their case and then answered questions. And that's on video. You can access that. I'm sure if you go Austin, Texas, fluoride, you'll be able to see that. Incidentally, talking about videos, if you go to our webpage, fluoridealert.org, you'll find, if you scroll down, you'll find a videotape called Professional Perspectives on Water Fluoridation. And there's 15 scientists on that, doctors, dentists, scientists like myself, explaining the arguments. 28 minutes. I think people will be convinced.
All right.
I'm not the only scientist that's opposed to fluoridation.
We'll get back to it. Not taking it out. One argument we haven't discussed for fluoride next on Coast to Coast. I'm talking with Dr. Paul Connett from St. Lawrence University, and the case against fluoride, you can link up to him through coasttocoastam.com. So we kind of touched on it, but we kind of gave it sort of a glancing blow, and I think it's way more interesting than that, since we talked about that fluoride is a drug and not a nutrient, but it's also not an approved drug, which that's the part that got me confused, especially as I was reading the CDC website and the way in which they make the case for fluoride in the water. But you argue that it's an unapproved drug, that according to the government, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no agency in the United States, no federal agency, that actually takes responsibility for fluoridation. The EPA regulates fluoride as a contaminant, not as an additive, as a contaminant.
It's fascinating. That's fascinating.
The FDA has never approved fluoride for ingestion. Now, the FDA has a warning for fluoride on toothpaste, on the back of a tube of toothpaste. It says only use a small amount, a pea-sized amount. If you should accidentally keep away from children under 6, if you should accidentally swallow more than the recommended amount, contact a poison center, get medical help. And
that's if you swallow too much of your own toothpaste.
Yeah, a pea-sized amount, Ian, is 1/4 milligram of fluoride. And that's the equivalent of 1 glass of fluoridated water. Could you imagine the same warning on the tap?
Well, until last week, they were still telling us that we had to drink 8 glasses of water every day. And most people who drink 8 glasses of water do it right out of the tap.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. But
the CDC, which looks as if it's taking responsibility, no. The CDC simply promotes fluoridation. So communities are trapped into thinking that this whole medical establishment is accepting responsibility for fluoridation as being safe, but there's nobody actually in charge of this program. When it comes down to the toxicity of the chemicals that are used, this is in the hands of a private body called the National Sanitation Foundation, National Sanitation Foundation, I think they're called, NSF, and they have a disclaimer that they're not responsible for their recommendations. And when they're asked for toxicological studies on the chemicals used, they refuse to give them because they don't have them.
Well, let's go back again. So the FDA, which if this is a drug, if it's an additive, then it's a drug. If they're saying we put it in there to prevent something happen to your body,
that's right.
Then it's a drug.
Yeah.
And right. But the FDA has not approved it as a drug. So they're insisting we put an unapproved drug in our bodies, and they're doing it through some sanitation committee department.
That's right. Which has industry on its board. The chemical manufacturers are the guys that produce this stuff are on the board of this NSF. But let's see what it means to be an unapproved drug. It means that it hasn't gone through the randomized clinical trials to demonstrate effectiveness.